Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gosztola, one of the show's hosts, and we're joined by Rania Khalek. Hello, Rania.
Hey,
And
Kevin.
also, you can see our guest for this week's show is Branko Marcetic, and he is the author of Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. He's also a writer for Jacobin, and he's written several articles on Joe Biden. So we welcome him to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And as we get going here with all our lovely faces out there for you, we are going to start with talking about this pandemic that we're all experiencing. Everyone's focused on the coronavirus outbreak, and we wanted to begin with you, Branko, talking about the responses that we've seen from Biden's campaign and then how that compares to the way that Bernie Sanders' campaign has responded. And obviously the issue of Joe Biden still not being a supporter of Medicare for all.
Yeah, so Biden and Sanders' speeches were kind of a contrast in leadership. Biden's speech obviously is being covered by the media and painted as this very presidential thing that conveyed strong, stable, steady leadership in contrast to Trump's chaos. But for people who actually tuned in at the time that it was meant to be on, they would have actually had to sit through half an hour of just dead air as Biden's staffers or other staffers rushed around trying to make sure that they could get rid of some buzzing that was making it impossible to hear anyone on stage and other technical difficulties. So actually started half an hour late to give his address. When it came to the actual policy specifics, Biden kind of opened the speech, first of all, by telling people, if you want to read the details of my plan, go to joebiden.com and you can find it there. So kind of directing people to just go and read it in their own time, not so much outlining the specifics in the speech. When he did get specific, he talked mostly about things like what people should do in their personal behavior, avoid shaking hands and hugging, that kind of thing, wash your hands often. He focused a lot on testing. He talked about the need to set up mobile testing and drive-through testing and to have up-to-date tests all over the country so that people could, obviously get checked out and know what they need to do. He focused a lot about making sure that people had information and about the virus and about what their symptoms might be and what they need to do. When he did get into the policy weeds of what the government needed to do to make sure that people who are in vulnerable positions or just otherwise, just generally working people, how to take care of them during the crisis. The only thing he mentioned was the emergency paid leave legislation, which the Democrats have already been working on in Congress. The rest of it was pretty scant. It was a lot of, if you look at the transcript of his speech, he says the words "we must" about 12 times. We must surge capacity to deal with this crisis. We must get through this and get out of this hole. We must do this. We must do that. A lot of declarative statements, not that much about the actual specifics, which is ironic because I think Sanders is usually the one that's cast as the kind of broad, generalizing, non-specific candidate. But if you actually watched his speech, I would say that his was a lot more traditionally presidential in many ways. He opened by telling people that this is not a time to be divided and to believe that we're all fending for ourselves and to think that we're all alone because we're stuck in our houses or quarantined or what have you. And it was a time to pull together. It was a time to realize that we all depend on each other and that kind of thing. Before outlining numerous specific proposals for what the government needed to do. So he called for the establishment of state and national hotlines that were well staffed and had well trained people working them, so that everyone could phone them up and find out, what are the symptoms of the virus, what do I need to do if I'm infected, and so on and so forth. He called for emergency lending to businesses so they could do small medium-sized businesses so they could do construction and they could produce things like ventilators, which there was a shortage of in hospitals. He called for maybe most significantly a moratorium on evictions and utility shutoffs, basically making the point that if people don't have that, if people are forced to go to work so they could pay their rent and pay their bills and everything, much more likely to spread the virus. Beyond that, he also called for the construction of emergency homeless shelters for not just homeless people, but victims of domestic abuse and students who are being quarantined off campus, and a whole host of other specific economic justice proposals. For example, he called for paid leave like Biden, but he specified exactly how much it would be. He said that tipped workers and domestic workers and gig workers needed to be part of this paid leave legislation. And he also snuck in his usual talking points about Medicare for all and telling the pharmaceutical industry that they can't be price gouging and that kind of thing. A lot of stuff that now in this moment I think has particular resonance. Given that we see that the US's lack of universal healthcare system is really disadvantaging it when it comes to dealing with this crisis. So overall, if you watch both speeches, you can't help but think that Sanders was a lot more prepared than Biden was. And it's not surprising because Biden has this long career of allergy to any government action to deal with a host of crises, unless you're talking about crime and drugs, in which case Biden was very picky to use the full force of the government. But I think in this case, in saying that demands really involve government action, Biden is on the back foot because of this reticence, this built-in reticence he has to actually call for really radical proposals.
Yeah, it really does show the stark difference here. And in so many ways, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about Joe Biden. I just wanted to make the point of everything you just said and all the things that Sanders said needs to be done really demonstrates everything that's wrong with our system. And this is this whole entire virus pandemic is highlighting everything that's wrong with our system. And Joe Biden is a part of that, of everything that's wrong with our system.
Well, and if I could just work in here, I noticed something very specific, which was if you looked at Biden's speech, he spent 20 seconds on the paid family and sick leave, and yet on his actual website, he has. Did you look at his plan on his website, Branko?
I did. I mean, it's a little more detailed.
There's a longer section there, and he talks about how he's gonna how he has some interest in Kirsten Gillibrand's Family Act, which is the paid family and sick leave legislation that Bernie signed on to in 2017. And so I suppose, is there anything to say here about a missed opportunity? Because if you're a pundit, you're looking for ways you can make an overture to progressives so that you'll have a better chance of winning in November. And that seems like a key issue that he could have spoken about to let people know that he is going to vote for something or support something that it's like an olive branch, so to speak.
Well, he did mention in his speech that we need an emergency plan for paid leave and we need a long-term plan. But this is very typical of his speech, which is that there was a lot of statements about what needs to be done and what must be done. Not really all that much being said about what he specifically wanted to do. He could have mentioned that, but I think this also points to what was the difference between his and Sanders' speeches, where Biden's speech, again, like I said, he didn't really go through some of these specifics. He just said, listen, I have a plan. It's on the website. And by the way, it's nearly 7,000 words long. So, good luck getting most people to go on their own time and read that. But he said, go and read my plan online. And I won't really go into any of the specifics here, which, I think this is going to be the big test in this coming debate on Sunday, because, we all know the difficulties that Biden has had on the campaign trail. And, the question is, away from a teleprompter, away from being able to say to people, well, go look online and read my plan, that's what you need to do. Is he going to be able to be as nimble and with some of these details around what he would do? And is he able to be as bold with what he would do when it's in real time, when it's unscripted, when he's having to react to not just audience questions, but Sanders' own responses? Is he going to be able to hold his own, I guess? Because I think if you look at the exit polls in Michigan and Missouri, for example, large majorities of people and of course Biden won those states pretty handily. Large majorities of people in those states said that they trusted Biden to deal with a major crisis over Sanders. And so this is going to be the big test. I mean, can Sanders reverse that perception and make people think that actually Biden may not be the fittest person to lead? Given Biden's behavior at the speech itself, he may have a shot at doing that.
So let's move on. And as we mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, you are the author of the book Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden, and you've been doing a lot of writing before the coronavirus outbreak and during, but as this has intensified, it may be pushed aside some of the more general issues that have been raised about Joe Biden's career. And so let's just begin. I mean, you very specifically cast Joe Biden as a kind of Forrest Gump of the Democratic Party's 40-year rightward turn. And as we promote this show, we'll share a link to this article where you describe the way in which he has put forward policy and the kind of politician that he's been. But why don't we focus in on that, and then we'll get to some of the more specific areas of concern about Joe Biden as a candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I can't take credit for that headline, unfortunately. There was someone much more clever than me came up with that. But it is true. He's one of these guys that I think a lot of people don't realize how ubiquitous he's been in American politics for nearly 40 years, or really actually nearly 50 years, if you count his vice presidency. I mean, the guy has really been involved in almost every disaster that's hit working class Americans over the past 40 years. And that was by design. I mean, Biden in the 80s, from 1978, really, that was a turning point. His re-election in 78, but in the 80s, it really took on momentum. He was part of an effort and really a leader on that effort to shift the Democratic Party to the right and to take it away from the priorities that had animated the party for the preceding 40, 50 years, and turn it into a more centrist, more conservative, more business-friendly party that was a lot closer to Reagan's vision. And so through the 80s, as Reagan wins these landslides, it has to be set against centrist Democrats running uninspiring centrist campaigns, not radical left-wingers, but the conventional choices for who would be best to win. Biden tours the country with the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Conference, which Bill Clinton was the chair of later, famously, and was a corporate-backed sort of effort to shift the party to the center, staffed mostly by Southern conservative Democrats. And Biden tours around the country with them, telling Democrats the party has to change. It can no longer look after just special interests. And by that, he means, constituencies like African Americans and Latinos and LGBTQ people and organized labor to an extent, and poor people. And he says that the party instead has to shift to looking after the middle class. And by that, he means, a specific version of the middle class, which is the kind of conservative suburbanites that Reagan and Nixon and other Republicans have focused on. And in many ways, that vision of the party has kind of become the Democrats, particularly under Trump, as a lot of kind of right-leaning, more affluent voters have become more and more of the party's base. And the party sort of shifted its strategy to trying to win over these voters instead of trying to mobilize its more working class base. So in some ways, Biden really won. And I guess we'll have to see in this election whether his vision is really going to keep being the thing that steers the Democratic Party, in 3 years ahead, or whether it's going to be something else that replaces it.
Branko, I'm curious what you think about, you just mentioned the sort of way that Biden helped the Democratic Party cultivate this base of suburbanites. How do you think that's played a role in the current Democratic primary? Because I think we've all been we've all been surprised by the way that the results have turned out between Sanders and Biden.
I think part of it is just fear of Trump. I mean, the Democratic electorate has been whipped up in such a frenzy over Trump since really 2017. Well, really since 2016, and a lot of this is people doing, or Democratic voters doing what they've been told for decades, and particularly over the last year, is what they have to do, which is to nominate a safe, centrist, establishment-friendly pick that won't rock the waters, rock the boat rather, and will just calmly usher in a new age that will restore what came before and get rid of Trump. This is if you look at MSNBC's coverage, a channel that many Democrats watch and trust in. This has been the tenor of their coverage of Biden. It's not about his his so-called gaffes. It's not about his policies, which are obviously very inadequate, particularly on climate. It's not about the campaign contributors that he gets, the fundraisers he goes to. It's all about what does the polling say, and why Biden was the so-called designated driver to lead the Democrats in a post-Trump era. And I think that's what we're seeing. But I do think you're right as well that the numbers, I haven't really seen a lot of conclusive numbers, but there are statistics that suggest that Biden's winning among mostly affluent people. He is still winning a lot of working class voters, but he is winning the majority of more affluent people. He is obviously winning overwhelmingly among older voters who have taken a lot of these lessons that Biden and Democrats of his generation have been spinning for decades about how you can't move too far left, there is some indication that it's not that youth turnout has fallen, but actually that turnout among older voters has really skyrocketed. Perhaps the impact of 4 years of this kind of Trump panic that has been fed by MSNBC and this kind of renewed activism among people who weren't paying attention. Perhaps this is one result, but we'll have to see. Once we get more data about what exactly the demographics were that came out and what the numbers were, I think we'll have a clear idea of what exactly is happening. But I do think that the Trump issue has kind of become the overriding thing, the electability versus Trump in the Democratic primary, whereas that wasn't the case in 2016. 2016 really was a policy argument, a policy discussion.
And then, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
We'll go out. You're ready, so I'll let you go ahead, fire.
Oh, I just wanted to get your take on Joe Biden's hawkishness. When you look at the most hawkish people in the Democratic Party, especially with what he did around the Iraq War, but just throughout his entire career. So what can you tell us about that?
So Biden's hawkishness is the product, again, of the 1980s and of Reagan's victories, which, I think we have to understand how much that era looms over this generation of Democrats. And Biden, similar to how he was saying, well, we not only have to change our what base we focus on, and we have to change our approach to economics and to budgetary concerns to align more with Reagan, but he also said we need to change our foreign policy. Biden was a guy who took a strong anti-war stance in his first 1972 campaign. It may have been the reason they won. And he had a sort of, he was no Bernie Sanders, but he was definitely on the left of the foreign policy spectrum for at least the first half of his first term. And then things started changing. We have to understand this was a decade of a lot more rebellion and of anti-war activism, which I think gave an inherently cautious conservative politician like Biden the space to take these positions. And then in the 1980s, when Reagan wins, Biden starts saying to Democrats, well, we have to change. We can't cringe at the use of force. We have to have a foreign policy that's close to Republicans, maybe not as aggressive, but one that is willing to use force and makes it clear that we're willing to use force. And then so in the 80s, he backs a whole host of military interventions that the U.S. runs. So he supports Reagan's strike on Libya, which kills Gaddafi's infant daughter, among others. He supports Reagan's invasion of Grenada, his illegal invasion of Grenada, which kills a few dozen people in a mental hospital. He supports Bush's invasion of Panama, which kills I think about 300 people, and he doesn't support the Gulf War. But once it's over, and he sees what a political success this has been for George H.W. Bush, Biden reverses and he says, "Well, I was wrong. I have to admit it that Bush was right about this, and he was fully justified to go in." And then from there on through the 90s becomes this leading Democratic war hawk on intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo and even Iraq. Which all leads to the year 2002, where Biden is again up for re-election. The Bush administration is being the drums of war in Iraq, and Biden, as he does in every campaign, decides that the only way that he can survive is by lurching way to the right and adopting his right-wing opponent's platform. And so Biden spends that entire year pushing for the Iraq war. He didn't just vote for it, he really led the charge on the Democratic side. He was on all the news shows talking about how Saddam had to be removed, how he was a threat, how he was maybe in cahoots with Al-Qaeda. He would boost the Bush administration's attempts to sell the war. For example, when Colin Powell did that famous speech, which he himself later called a blot on his record, Biden came out and said, that was a masterclass. That's everything. That's going to convince the people. That shows that's conclusive proof that Saddam is hiding these weapons. Of course, that war is a complete disaster. For some reason, though, doesn't in Washington take away the reputation Biden has as a foreign policy expert. He remains a leading voice in Democratic foreign policy throughout that decade and beyond once he gets picked by Obama, partly for his foreign policy chops or supposed foreign policy chops. Under Obama, Biden takes some actually less hawkish positions. So he was not into the war in Libya. He didn't want to do a troop surge in Afghanistan, and he warned against the assassination of Osama bin Laden. But at the same time, Biden, to avoid this boots on the ground thing, but because he's also not totally in favor of just basically ending wars, that he still has to find a way to have the U.S. be bombing and shooting people in other countries. And so the thing that he decides on is this counterterrorism plus strategy, which becomes the Obama administration's foreign policy, basically, where instead of sending lots of soldiers to invade a country, what you do is you just have drones and planes swooping overhead, bombing people, and sending in special strike forces, in the middle of the night to do raids on houses. And now Trump has inherited that foreign policy and those powers, which of course we saw how disastrous that was with his assassination of General Soleimani and this most recent strike in Iran that happened just yesterday.
There are two things to raise here, which is first off, one thing that has given Joe Biden some problems is the same thing that gave Hillary Clinton problems, which is that he's a supporter of the Iraq War. But what we've seen that's a difference between him and Hillary Clinton is that he's out there lying about his record on the Iraq War. And so I wonder what you make of that and what kind of effect that may have had on the primary so far, and your thoughts about this, because obviously we have a record in Biden's career of habitual lying. That's something that you can't disagree with. But then after you address that, again, like this all fits into his political rightward interest in making common cause with Republicans. It's possible that these lies are really just in service to his own political ideology of believing that he can compromise and work with these Republicans. And we heard much earlier on this primary, before anybody started to vote, this idea that Donald Trump is going to leave office and he's going to magically step in as President Joe Biden, and he's going to work with Republicans and they're going to be willing to compromise on all of these measures that he wants to have passed, whatever it is, if it's balanced budget amendments whatever the centrist agenda will be. And yet that is completely opposite of what happened under President Barack Obama. You had constant obstruction from Republicans of people trying to thwart anything that Barack Obama wanted to do, even when that was perhaps in service to a corporate status quo.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Biden has a long history of lying, and I think the question with people is now or today, is Biden consciously lying, or is he just confused and genuinely believes what he's saying? I think, on the issue of the Iraq War, I think it's very clear that he is knowingly lying. His statements about the idea that he supported the war, opposed the war as soon as it started, that he voted for the war, to stop the war, this kind of thing. It has been fact-checked numerous times, not just by me, but by outlets like CNN, Washington Post, and others. So there's no way he doesn't know that what he's not saying is not the truth, because it's been fact-checked numerous times now, and he keeps saying it. And the truth is he has to, because his record on this is indefensible. And it's very easy, I think, for Biden to lie, because, as you say, he has a career doing it. He said that he was a civil rights protester, which he wasn't at all. He was forced to admit that by reporters, and he dropped out of the 1987 race. And then now he's back saying that again. On this issue of working with Republicans in Congress, I mean, it's a complete fantasy. Obviously, it's completely delusional, given that Biden himself lived through 8 years of Republican obstructionism under Obama, and saw the Republicans' refusal to work with Obama on basically anything. But I do think that Biden can and does believe he can work with Republicans in Congress, because that's what he did. As vice president, he was always the guy the administration sent to negotiate with Mitch McConnell and other congressional Republicans when they were setting up a hostage crisis over, a debt limit or unemployment insurance or what have you, or this effort to strike a grand bargain on spending cuts. Biden was always the guy they sent, and Biden was basically just a doormat for Mitch McConnell, who would just steamroll him and make sure that Republicans got everything they wanted, and the Democrats really didn't get anything. We might think this is absurd, but for Biden, this seems to genuinely be a good thing. I think it doesn't matter what the outcome is for him. It's just the process of bipartisanship and compromise that's important, and that shows that things are working okay. As one example, in 2010. Biden negotiated with Mitch McConnell over extending unemployment insurance at a time when the recession was really terrible, and McConnell extracted from him a whole host of concessions, including a lower capital gains tax, locked in for 2 years, and other things. It was this very lopsided deal that even Democrats like Dianne Feinstein, conservative Democrats, erupted in outrage. They were like, this is huge. Why have you given them all this stuff? This was the package that Bernie Sanders famously spent 8 hours filibustering in the Senate that really put him on the national map. And as terrible as this deal was, and it was sold even by the Obama administration to Democrats. They told them basically, yeah, it's a crappy deal, but what else are we going to do? Biden then went, I think a month or 2 months later, to this University of Kentucky event that was kind of honoring Mitch McConnell, and he gave this speech where he pointed to that deal and he said, that shows that we can still work in a bipartisan way to solve problems in Washington. The system worked in this case. And there was no trace of irony or anything. And Mitch McConnell, of course, sat there smiling at him, knowing this guy could easily be used by him again, and was to extract more concessions. So I think for Biden, I think he can work with Republicans and probably will. And what he will work on is things like cutting Medicare and Social Security, which Biden has tried to cut for decades with Republicans. And now he will be in his best position ever to do so.
Do you think that, before everybody was saying that Joe Biden's not electable, but I actually think that this current public health crisis that we're watching unfold changes that. I don't think it actually guarantees anymore we'd have a second Trump presidency. Do you think that there is a good chance that if Joe Biden is a nominee, he'd win?
It's tough to say. Anything can happen. I think that he's an incredibly risky choice to put up against Trump, not just because of his policy record, but even in the midst of this crisis, Biden's debate performances have been less than stellar. I think everyone can agree with that. People certainly were saying it all through 2019. Media analysts and Democratic candidates. We'll see how he fares in this debate on Sunday. But this entire time he's been shielded from public scrutiny because either they've limited his public exposure in unscripted events, including one-on-one interviews and with news stations, or they have in debates, because they've been so packed with so many candidates, Biden has really only had to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes at most every debate. And of course, even then, his answers have been rambling, incoherent, and sometimes completely nonsensical. And there is a good chance, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but there is a good chance that you put him up against Trump on a debate stage, and people go, well, Trump really screwed up with this virus response. At the same time, I don't know if I trust this guy who can't seem to formulate a coherent thought to really be the one to lead us through this. But yeah, I think you are right in the sense that the crisis has definitely put things in flux. I think it's changed a lot of things, a lot of calculations about what was certain and what wasn't. And I think voters may well now, similar to in 2008 when the Wall Street crash happened, it shifted the race there, where suddenly Obama did not look quite as risky in an experience. It was actually John McCain who did the risky one. It may well change the dynamics of the race in making people's top priority, not necessarily getting rid of Trump, or something else, but just who is the best person to deal with this crisis at this time. And we'll see who is able to make the best pitch.
So there's one more thing I wanted to make sure we work in here before we let you go, which is the history that you've written about with Joe Biden betraying Black voters. And I suppose the way that I would set it up is just to note a recent development that we've seen happen that dramatically shifted the race, where you have the patriarch, Representative Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, essentially playing kingmaker, fulfilling his role, helping to deliver South Carolina to Joe Biden, making sure that those Black voters in South Carolina were going to turn out and support Joe, and giving him that victory that allowed this opening for which the establishment in the Democratic Party could align and unite around Joe Biden. And then now, of course, this is the voice that's talking about shutting it all down, ending the primary. He was even advocating for canceling this debate that's scheduled in Arizona on March 15th. And so you have these Black patriarch leaders playing this role of helping Joe Biden win the nomination. And you also have this, the way that Joe Biden has been able to capitalize on his time in the Obama administration working as vice president for Barack Obama. And that's something that he's been able to use against Bernie Sanders quite well. And so I think it's important to set the record straight and have you speak about his history of betraying Black voters.
It is the irony of ironies that Biden's political career and his presidential hopes have been revived basically because of African American voters' loyalty to him, which I think we can ascribe to several reasons, several very rational reasons. But the sad thing is that Biden has built this career where he has had really strong Black support throughout his career. In 1972, when he first entered the Senate, he ended up doing second best only under George McGovern with Black voters. He actually, he won the Black vote against his Republican opponent, who had a very long and good civil rights record and was actually endorsed by the United States' first Black senator. And despite this, Biden's entire career is about strategically letting down exactly those voters and strategically betraying them on certain issues that will help him later get elected. Busing, of course, is the one that people all know about, and what people, I think, don't realize about his anti-busing crusade, which was prompted by a court order that made Wilmington schools desegregate, is that Biden not only did this for sheer political expediency, but also that his efforts were harmful to the civil rights cause as a whole. The amendment that he ended up passing into law that was renewed year after year after that precluded what was then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare from using money to fund busing programs. And it didn't have any impact on Delaware because that was a court-ordered program. But in other parts of the country, superintendents and civil rights workers complained frequently that this legislation was the biggest roadblock to achieving desegregation, because even voluntary desegregation of school plans couldn't be sometimes done to completion because of this ban on HEW funds being used for busing. In the 80s, Biden obviously went hard on crime, which I argue in the book was this counter-revolution against the gains of the civil rights movement. People who were against those gains found a different, less overtly racist way to reimpose the conditions of Jim Crow and slavery. I don't think Biden was thinking this when he was doing it, but because of his need to always kowtow to the most right-wing forces in the United States, he played a very important role in making it happen, unwittingly. Then you have Biden's role in the 80s and 90s on the Judiciary Committee, when he let through several hard right justices that ended up radically reshaping the legal landscape in the United States. And probably the most important of these, Clarence Thomas was very important, obviously, and Biden's mishandling of the Anita Hill accusations. People should go and read about that. I mean, I try and synthesize it in the book, but it's worse than what people even know. Incompetence to almost to the point of purposeful sabotage. But even beyond Clarence Thomas, probably the most important thing that Biden did was led through Anthony Kennedy, who now we think of as this, formerly moderate swing justice who could be reasoned with and everything, but was actually kind of the keystone to the right-wing takeover of the court in the 80s and 90s. Kennedy was handpicked by Biden and suggested to Reagan as someone who would be acceptable, because Reagan's previous two picks had fallen apart and not worked out. Kennedy, in his confirmation hearing, Biden asked him just nonsense, silly questions, like if he had read a specific book that he was thinking of, and whether it was harder to be a judge in Canada or the United States, and this kind of thing. He said literally, well, hopefully we can just all get out of here. He just wanted to wrap things up as soon as possible. There was a liberal lobbyist who testified, who accused Biden and other committee members of playing patty cake with Kennedy, basically through his hearing. Kennedy had a lot of concerning things in his history and his rulings that Biden did not ask about whatsoever. Kennedy overwhelmingly sailed through confirmation, ended up in the court. Once he got in the court, one of the first things he and the rest of the conservative justices did was actually pick up a civil rights case, not because it had been petitioned to them, which is how it usually works in the Supreme Court, but just by selecting it. They just decided, we're going to take on this case, and they basically struck down and weakened civil rights protections in that way, and did a whole string of decisions over the course of Kennedy's first few years on the court, striking down civil rights protections. And of course, in the long term, there's been much more of that. There's been, abortion rights restrictions have been let through. Obviously the voting down of the Voting Rights Act and everything else. So, that's another element where Biden has betrayed Black voters, because he facilitated the rolling back of some of these gains of the civil rights movement. And beyond that, Biden's economic policies as well have often been detrimental to mostly African-American communities. Welfare reform, which Biden took a lead role in pushing and he voted for, that has been devastating for communities of color all over the country. Obviously, repealing Glass-Steagall, voting for NAFTA, all of these have had long-term consequences for people's jobs. Biden also voted for the balanced budget constitutional amendment 3 years in a row. It very narrowly didn't pass, but that would have been absolutely devastating to these to these government programs that a lot of communities of color rely on. Not to mention, would have been devastating for dealing with a pandemic of this kind that we're seeing now. And then, of course, Biden's frequent attempts to cut Social Security and Medicare. And Social Security is a program that large majorities of African Americans not only like, but rely on after retirement to survive. So, I mean, I could go on and on and on and on, but this is a guy who has systematically shown that when it comes to the really big key issues, yes, he'll vote to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act and that kind of thing, and that's great. I mean, it's the bare minimum. But when it comes to actually achieving economic and social justice for these communities, Biden is not only nowhere to be found, but he's actually working against those things.
Well, I think we about have to wrap here so that you can get on. I know you have a media interview that you're going to be doing. So again, I just want to say the book is called Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And as for everyone who was tuning into our show, thanks for watching. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. And anything else to add before we go, Rania?
No, thank you so much for joining us. That was really illuminating.
No, thanks, Kevin.
So we really appreciate it, and we really appreciate your work.
Cheers. Well, you guys too, of course.